Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobbie Holmes. This is part 2 of episode 24, The Toy Box Killer. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, you should probably go back and do that first. We left off with Cynthia Vigil escaping from the home of David Parker Ray. He and his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, were holding her captive. She endured 3 days of rape and torture, all while being chained to a bed in the living room of his double-wide trailer. She was able to get free and ran naked down the road and found a helpful neighbor named Darlene. Cynthia was taken to a hospital where she was physically evaluated and interviewed about her assault. In the meantime, as soon as Cindy came to after taking an ice pick to the head, she called David at work to inform him that Cynthia had escaped. He left work without any explanation. He picked up Cindy and they drove around looking for Cynthia. After a while of searching, instead of making a run for it, they head towards home. But on their way back, they were pulled over by police and detained. While investigators wrapped up their interview with Cynthia at the hospital, they drove over to where Cindy and David were being held to get their side of the story. Just a quick description of David. He's pretty much the definition of white trash. I'll post pictures on my social media. David Parker Ray looks like he's been a chain smoker since he's had the dexterity to hold a cigarette. Tall but scrawny, his skin tanned from the sun, covered in deep wrinkles. He had shaggy hair, a borderline mullet, really. Sported a large, bushy mustache that hung down over his lip. You should see the smile on this asshole's face in his mugshot. It's disturbing. David and Cindy admitted to holding Cynthia against her will. But they said it was because she was high on heroin and they wanted to help her through the initial withdrawal of rehabilitation. They denied any sexual abuse, but a physical examination was being completed on Cynthia as they spoke. After the interviews, Cindy was taken to the hospital to have her head wound evaluated. While at the hospital, Cynthia spots Cindy and makes a scene, pointing and shouting, "That's her! That's the woman that held me hostage." Cindy speaks up and says they better really check her out because she's a heroin addict. I think she's backing up their story about trying to help her rehabilitate. Investigators went over to David's residence to take a look inside and see if Cynthia's claims would hold up. Chains were found all around the bed where she was kept. Broken glass on the bed, as well as a bloodied ice pick. A bucket full of human waste was next to the bed. Apparently, they didn't even allow her to use a toilet. Everything was exactly as Cynthia had described it. David and Cindy were arrested and bail was set for $1 million each, cash, pretty much ensuring they would remain in jail. Police got a warrant for a more thorough search of the property. They started with the main living space, his double-wide trailer. It was super messy and cluttered. Outside of what the officers already found day 1 in the living room, they also found what seemed to be trophies. Over 400 pieces of random jewelry and accessories, they were kept in a secure area, making it obvious that it didn't belong to Cindy. They went around back and opened the white tractor trailer that sat on the property. When investigators opened the door to David's toy box, the first thing they see were signs that say, "The Bondage Room" and "Satan's Den." I've already described to you the horrific torture devices he kept inside, but they also found a clipboard, audio tapes, and VHS tapes. On the clipboard, there was a stack of papers. He had written descriptions of women, height, weight, nationality, etc. The list was dates of abductions from 1993 to 1997. On a bulletin board, you could see Polaroids that he took of his victims while they were drugged, bound, and gagged. There's a tripod with a video camera pointed directly at the customized gynecologist chair. Investigators play the VHS tape that's in the camcorder. It shows a woman strapped down in the chair. She doesn't seem fully with it, as if she's been drugged. You can see David enter the frame and press play for his introductory audio message that I played for you guys, which goes on, and then all the sexual torture she endured is caught on video. Authorities now know of 2 of David's victims, Cynthia and Angelica. They hope to be able to identify the woman on this videotape. The video was somewhat blurry, but it did show that there was a distinctive tattoo on the woman's calf. Investigators sent the video to the FBI, where they were able to enhance the image and see that it was a tribal-style tattoo of a swan. They put the image of the tattoo out into the media, asking the person who has this tattoo to come forward so they could ask her some questions. And here's the crazy part. A woman named Kelly contacts them and she's like, yeah, that's my tattoo. They started asking simple questions about David, a sexual assault she had experienced. Kelly was clueless. She had no idea what they were talking about. They play her the tape. Poor thing. She's out there living her life oblivious to the fact that she was raped and tortured, and now she has to sit and watch it. Kelly is dumbfounded. She honestly doesn't remember any of this happening to her. But there was a strange instance when she blacked out for a few days and woke up alone in the desert. And you don't wonder where you've been? What happened? Anyways, here is what happened. Kelly was living in Elephant Butte with her husband. They got into a huge fight one night, and Kelly decides to go out with her girlfriends for a couple of drinks. While she's at the bar, she's joined by an acquaintance, Jessie, who, if you remember, is the daughter of David Parker Ray. Pause for a moment. Just a little background on Jessie. She was the daughter of David's 3rd ex-wife. Her relationship with her father was bumpy. They grew marijuana together in a small greenhouse, and Jessie did the dealing. Marijuana as well as crystal meth. At one point, there was a falling out between her and David over money. Jessie was so pissed that she called in an anonymous tip to the FBI about David and, quote, a sex slave ring. David was interviewed by the FBI, but Jessie was so vague with her tip that he just lied his way out of the situation. They didn't have any evidence. David never knew it was his own daughter that tipped off the FBI. In the years following, they patched up their relationship and became very close. Jessie knew all about the toy box and became an accomplice. So back to the bar. Jessie drugs Kelly's beer. She starts feeling pretty drowsy and realizes she shouldn't drive and asks for a ride home. Jessie volunteers. But she doesn't take Kelly home. She brings her back to dear old Dad. Not only does his girlfriend Cindy play a role in this, but now he has his daughter luring in women too. It's just disgusting. Kelly is chained up and kept sedated through the entire 2 days she spent in the toy box. She was so heavily sedated that David thought she had died and dropped her off in the desert. Kelly woke up alone and confused. She started walking, and a man stopped to ask if she was okay. Kelly asked if he could take her home. When she gets home, her husband doesn't believe her story that she has no memory of the past 2 days. He thought she was cheating on him. Either that or she was on a drug bender. Kelly and the husband separate. She moved to Colorado and never thought about it again, apparently. According to reports from the other women, I would think Kelly would be in some major pain and show signs of physical abuse on her body. Cynthia had bruising, cuts, and burns after 2 days of torture from David, and she never even made it to the toy box. I don't know how you can ignore that. I would definitely be concerned as to what happened to me and inform authorities. But I'm not a drug addict. I think people who break the law do everything they can to avoid police. Once the FBI shows her the video, it all comes back to her. She's been having nightmares about being raped, but she thought they were just nightmares. Investigators now have 3 victims of David's assaults who can testify against him. In addition, while Cindy continued to be questioned, she was singing like a canary. They offered her a lesser sentence if she shared information about David, and she held nothing back. She told them about a business partner of David's named Billy Bowers. Something shady went down and David murdered Billy, throwing his body in the lake. A few days later, the body floated to the surface. David learned from his mistake. After that, he would open up the stomachs of his victims, fill it with rocks, and close it back up with wire. This ensured the bodies would stay at the bottom of Elephant Butte Reservoir. Cindy admitted that she did participate in the rape and torture. She claimed she had nothing to do with the killing or disposing of bodies, but she believes there were at least 7 women in the lake, probably more like 14 total murders, and according to David's own clipboard list, over 60 total abductions. Elephant Butte Reservoir is so vast, so deep, and so murky that investigators thought it would be impossible to find the bodies. They danced around the idea of draining the entire lake, but that would be extremely time-consuming and expensive. So they did nothing. No bodies were ever discovered. The only evidence that they have supporting murder was the clipboard with David's own handwriting and the word of Cindy Hendy. Cindy then told investigators about a man named Dennis Yancey. Dennis became friends with David when they realized their common practice of Satanism. Remember the signs in the side of the toy box that said Satan's Den? Well, there were also books on witchcraft and devil worship found. Dennis would frequent David's home, but more for the practice of devil worship, not so much toy box play. Jessie also became pretty close friends with Dennis. He was closer to her in age than David. One evening, Jessie borrowed David's truck and headed down to the Blue Water Saloon with Dennis. On the way, she looked over and said, "We're going to bring home your ex-girlfriend Marie tonight." I'm not sure if Dennis knew exactly what would happen to Marie, but after a few drinks and probably a roofie added to one of Marie's, the 3 piled into the truck together. Jessie pulled a gun on Marie and handcuffed her. She drove back to David's home and took Marie to the toy box. In the days following, Dennis stayed at David's house, probably trying to oversee the situation, hoping that she would get the hypnosis treatment and be set free. David emerges and tells Dennis that he's finished with her. David and Dennis enter the toy box. Marie is heavily sedated. David says she isn't needed anymore and hands Dennis a rope. Dennis knows what he's asking him to do. He doesn't want to, but he doesn't feel like he has a choice. If he refuses, David would probably kill him too. Dennis ties the rope around Marie's neck and tightened it. Once she was dead, the pair drove out to the desert and disposed of her body in a ravine. Investigators then interviewed Dennis Yancey. He broke down and admitted what happened to Marie. He was being charged with kidnapping, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. He informed the police that he had no part of planning anything. It was Jesse's plan to kidnap, and he just went along with it. He killed at David's request out of fear. Dennis took them to the area to the desert where he thought they dropped her body, but it all looked the same and there were no defining landmarks. Cindy also made the comment that she thought David went back and moved the body because he didn't trust Dennis would keep his mouth shut. Once Dennis realized there was no body found, he was like, just kidding. I didn't kidnap or kill anybody. He recanted his whole confession. Apparently, a body wasn't necessary for a conviction, though. Dennis Yancey was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Another piece of info from Cindy, she told investigators they might want to dig up the backyard. A dig and cadaver dog search took place across David's property, but there were no sign of human remains found. David denied any rape or murder accusations. He said all women who joined him in the toy box were willing participants, sex workers who were being paid to be there. I think we all know that's a load of bullshit. It seems like most women were quote-unquote hypnotized and then released. But I have no doubt that some didn't make it out alive. David stood trial for the 3 separate women assaulted, Cynthia, Angelica, and Kelly. He was never charged for Angelica's abduction, sexual abuse, and torture because she died of a drug overdose before trial began. With the conviction of Cynthia and Kelly's cases, David was sentenced to 224 years in prison. I don't understand why they do that. Just say life. He's already in his 50s, and no one's living to 224 years old. Jessie served 2.5 years in prison and 5 years probation for her willing participation in the abductions. Cindy Hendy was sentenced to 36 years in prison. She was up for parole in 2017, serving 2 more years in the prison, and was released in 2019. In 2002, David seemed ready to finally admit his wrongdoing. He was scheduled for another interview with investigators, and boom, heart attack. David Parker Ray drops dead before he's able to confess. If he was really going to fess up about who he killed and where he disposed of their bodies, this really saddens me that these women won't be found. They won't be recognized as victims or get the justice they deserve. The crazy part about this case is I truly believe there were way more people involved. More than just Cindy, Hendy, and Jessie. Remember me saying that a man helped direct Cynthia to the motorhome and that he invited friends over to join him in the toy box? Other people knew about it and or participated. And those people are living their life without any consequences. A friend of mine, Justin Girock, he grew up in Las Cruces, New Mexico, a little over an hour south of Elephant Butte. Justin and his friends spent their summers at Elephant Butte Reservoir. I wanted him to weigh in and share with you guys what the area was like at that time. By the way, Justin is also who helped me with my podcast logo, so shout out to Justin and his graphic designer. I so appreciate your help.
Hi, my name's Justin. I'm a friend of Bobbie's. We were talking about her podcast, and I'd mentioned the Toy Box Killer in New Mexico. She did some research on it and then obviously decided to make a podcast about it. Now, I was born and raised in Las Cruces, New Mexico, which is about 80 miles south of Elephant Butte Lake, or the town of Truth or Consequences, which we would always call TRC. Now, to give you an idea of how close we would normally be when we would go visit the lake, my friend's parents have a lake trailer where they keep their bass boats and things like that off of Catfish Road. Now, if you go Google 513 Bass Road, Elephant Butte Lake, New Mexico, that's the location of David Parker Ray's trailer and where he had his torture toy box. We were one road over from where this was going on. So mind you, at the time, I was in high school. I graduated in 2000. So he was doing this while we were there, literally a street over from this absolutely disturbing situation. Now, even though the area is pretty desolate, because when you look on a map, you'll see that Elephant Butte Lake in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, is located on a strip of highway between Las Cruces, New Mexico, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now, on the left side, when you're looking at the map, is National Forest and a couple very, very small towns, not even street light worthy towns. On the right side is a 350,000 acre ranch owned by Ted Turner, the media billionaire. and Holloman Air Force Base and White Sands Missile Range. These are all protected areas that you cannot get into. So even though the town itself of Truth or Consequences / Elephant Butte Lake was populated with some people, it was a pretty desolate town. You'd have to come from Las Cruces for about an hour and a half drive to get there, which would probably be the closest town of any decent size. Now, looking at that, you'll see that even though in a lot of the books and other stories and podcasts, they make it sound like he was out in the middle of nowhere. He was in the large scale of things, but in the town, he was in a neighborhood. This was going on where kids would play. We would be outside ourselves, riding bikes, drinking beer in high school, doing things like that, getting into plenty of trouble. So there were cops around all the time. This wasn't going on out in the middle of nowhere, the desert. This was happening in a town where people would go to vacation. And even though there, was crime and prostitution, that wasn't the crux of what the town was about. For the most part, it was a lake town. People would show up with their boats, tiny bass boats to big, massive race boats. It was a lot of fun, like you would assume a little lake town would be.
Oh my goodness, that's just insane. I can't imagine looking back now knowing you were less than a mile away from the torture happening inside of the toy box. That's it for this week. Be sure to subscribe to Killer Stories so you never miss a new episode. I greatly appreciate the reviews left on Apple Podcast or my Facebook page. Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast. Twitter handle is at Killer Stories PC. Email any story suggestions to killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Thank you, Justin, for this story suggestion. If you want to support the show, visit buymeacoffee.com/killerstories. There you can give a one-time donation and leave me a note if you feel so inclined. It helps cover the costs of monthly publication of my podcast. I appreciate and love all the support. Until next time, this has been a killer story.